The dust swirled thick and heavy down the main street of Cedar Ridge, carried on a wind that seemed to blow straight from hell itself. Margaret Thorne stood at the edge of town, her once fine traveling dress now torn and stained with the dirt of countless miles. Her dark hair, which had once been pinned in elegant curls, hung limp and tangled around her shoulders. She clutched a worn leather satchel, all that remained of her former life. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, casting long shadows from the weathered wooden buildings that lined the street. Cedar Ridge was like every other frontier town she'd passed through in the last 3 weeks, rough-hewn and unforgiving, built by hard men who had little patience for those who couldn't pull their own weight. Margaret's throat was parched, her lips cracked from the desert air. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, and the hunger gnawed at her stomach like a living thing. But it was the thirst that drove her forward, toward the general store at the corner of Main and 3rd. The bell above the door jangled as she pushed it open. The proprietor, a stout man with mutton chops and suspicious eyes, looked up from his ledger. "Water," Margaret rasped. "Please, just a cup of water." The man's gaze traveled over her disheveled appearance, taking in the mud-caked hem of her dress and the desperate gleam in her gray eyes. "This ain't no charity house," he said flatly. "You got money." Margaret's fingers trembled as she reached into her satchel, knowing already what she would find. Nothing. She'd spent her last coin on a crust of bread in the previous town. I could work," she offered. "Clean, or help with inventory. I know my letters and numbers." A woman emerged from behind a curtain at the back of the store, the proprietor's wife. Judging by the proprietary way she moved through the space, her face hardened when she saw Margaret. "Samuel Harrison," she hissed to her husband. "That's her. That's the woman from Fort Bellingham." The change in the proprietor's demeanor was immediate. His suspicious look transformed into one of disgust. "Get out," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "We don't serve your kind here." "Please," Margaret begged. "I don't know what you've heard, but—" "We heard plenty," the woman interjected, her voice shrill. "Jezebel, harlot, bringing shame on decent folk." Margaret felt the familiar sting of tears, but she'd learned to hold them back. Crying only made it worse. "It's not true," she whispered. "None of it is true." "Out!" The proprietor came around the counter, his bulk imposing. "Before I call the sheriff." Margaret stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the threshold as she fled the store. The bell's cheerful jingle mocked her desperation. Outside, she leaned against the rough wooden wall, trying to catch her breath. A group of women in calico dresses stood across the street, their heads bent together in whispered conference. When they noticed her looking, they quickly averted their eyes and hurried away, clutching their baskets closer. The story had followed her like a plague, from Fort Bellingham to Willow Creek, from Willow Creek to Cedar Ridge. Always the same whispers, the same accusations. A woman who'd brought scandal upon herself, a woman who'd fallen from grace. The details varied with each telling, growing more lurid and damning. But the result was always the same: closed doors and turned backs. Margaret forced herself to move on. The boarding house was 3 buildings down, its painted sign advertising clean rooms, respectable clientele only. The emphasis on respectable made her stomach churn, but she had to try. Mrs. Abigail Fletcher, the boarding house proprietress, was a severe woman with steel-gray hair pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her features. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed. As Margaret approached, "I'm looking for a room," Margaret began. But Mrs. Fletcher cut her off. "No vacancies." Margaret could see through the front window that the parlor was empty, the rooms available slate still propped in the corner. "Please, ma'am, just for one night. I can pay." The lie came easily now. "My funds are temporarily delayed, but—" "I said no vacancies." "Mrs." Fletcher repeated, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Not for the likes of you. This is a Christian establishment. I am a Christian woman," Margaret protested, her voice breaking. "Mrs." Fletcher's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Christian women don't do what you did. Now get off my porch before I have my son escort you off." Margaret descended the steps on unsteady legs. Where else could she go? The saloon would never serve a woman alone, and certainly not one with her reputation. The hotel was too expensive even if they would have her. That left. The church stood at the end of Main Street, its white steeple reaching toward heaven like a finger of accusation. Margaret had avoided churches since Fort Bellingham, but desperation drove her forward. Surely a man of God would show mercy where others had shown none. The heavy wooden doors were open to catch the evening breeze. Inside, the air was cooler, scented with beeswax and old wood. Reverend Josiah Mills was at the altar, arranging hymn books for the evening service. He was a thin man with an austere face, his black coat hanging loose on his narrow frame. When he turned and saw her, his expression shifted from mild inquiry to recognition, and from recognition to something that might have been pity or disgust. "Miss Thorne," he said, and Margaret's heart sank. Even here, her name was known. "Reverend," she said, dropping to her knees on the hard wooden floor. "I seek sanctuary. Just for tonight, I have nowhere else to go." The Reverend's fingers drummed against his Bible. "I cannot have you here," he said finally. "It would scandalize my congregation. There are appearances to consider." "But the Bible speaks of charity," Margaret pleaded. "Of forgiveness, of—" "The Bible also speaks of reaping what one sows," Reverend Mills interrupted. "You made your choices, Miss Thorne. Now you must live with the consequences." "I made no choice." The words burst from her before she could stop them. "What happened to me was not my choice." The Reverend's face flushed. "Please leave. I'll pray for your soul. But you cannot stay here." Margaret pulled herself to her feet, dignity the only thing she had left. As she walked back down the aisle, she heard the Reverend's voice behind her. "May God have mercy on you, for the world will not." Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. The temperature was already dropping, desert nights were cold, and she had no coat. Margaret stood on the church steps, looking out at the town that had rejected her. Windows glowed with lamplight, families gathering for supper, safe and warm behind closed doors. None of those doors would open for her. She made her way slowly back toward the center of town, each step an effort. Outside the Lucky Dollar Saloon, cowboys were gathering for their evening revelry. The sound of a piano drifted through the bat-wing doors, along with rough laughter and the clink of glasses. One man stood apart from the others, leaning against a post. He was tall and lean, with a kind of stillness that spoke of patience learned through long hours in the saddle. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face, but Margaret could feel his eyes on her as she passed. She'd learned to recognize the different types of stares. There was the leer of men who thought her fair game, the disgust of decent women, the pity of those who believed the stories but still felt a twinge of Christian guilt. But this man's gaze was different, steady and considering, without judgment or appetite. Margaret forced herself to keep walking, though she had nowhere to go. The edge of town beckoned, the vast emptiness beyond. Maybe it would be better to walk into that darkness and let the desert claim her. At least then the whispers would stop. The shame would end. The constant, gnawing hunger and thirst would finally cease. She didn't notice the cowboy push off from the post and follow at a distance, his boots silent in the dust. She only knew that she had been banished from every door, and the approaching night held no mercy for the forsaken. The desert stretched before Margaret like an ocean of dust and stone, the last buildings of Cedar Ridge fading behind her in the gathering darkness. Her feet moved mechanically, one in front of the other, though she no longer knew why she bothered. The road dissolved into a barely visible trail that wound between sagebrush and scattered rocks. The moon hadn't risen yet, and stars were just beginning to pierce the darkening sky. Margaret stumbled over a stone, catching herself against a gnarled juniper tree. Her palms scraped against the rough bark, but she barely felt it. Physical pain had become a constant companion, easier to bear than the other kind. She sank down beside the tree, her legs finally refusing to carry her further. This was as good a place as any to stop. To finally stop. The desert would be kind in its own way, clean and honest in its indifference, not like the cruelty of people who wrap their hatred in righteousness. Margaret closed her eyes and let the memories wash over her. It seemed important, here at the end, to remember who she had been before she became the woman everyone whispered about. Her father's house in Philadelphia rose in her mind, red brick and white columns, gardens where roses bloomed in ordered rows. She'd been Margaret Thorne, daughter of a respected banker. She'd worn silk dresses and kid gloves, played the piano in the parlor while young men paid court. She'd had prospects then, a future mapped out as clearly as the streets of the city. But her father's death had changed everything. The house had to be sold to pay his debts, debts she hadn't known existed until the creditors came calling. Her mother had passed years before, and she had no brothers, no uncles to turn to, just a cousin in Fort Bellingham who'd written to say there was opportunity in the West for a woman of education. She could teach, perhaps, or work as a governess. Margaret laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the desert silence. What a fool she'd been, believing in new beginnings, believing that hard work and virtue would be enough. Fort Bellingham had been nothing like Philadelphia. It was a rough military outpost surrounded by a town that serviced the soldiers' needs. Her cousin, she'd discovered upon arrival, ran a boarding house that catered to a particular clientele. Not quite a brothel, but not quite respectable either. She'd tried to leave immediately, but she had no money for return passage. So she'd found work at the general store, keeping the books and writing letters for those who couldn't. It was honest work, and she'd told herself it would be temporary, just until she saved enough to go somewhere else, start over properly. Then Charles Whitmore had arrived in town. Captain Charles Whitmore, with his easy smile and Eastern manners. He'd seemed like salvation itself, educated, refined, from a good Boston family. When he began courting her, she'd allowed herself to hope again. Margaret pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to block out what came next. But the memories wouldn't be stopped. The evening he'd invited her to dinner at his quarters to discuss their future. How she'd gone, trusting and eager, wearing her best remaining dress. The other officers who were supposed to be there but weren't. The wine that had tasted strange. The morning after, waking confused and disheveled, with Charles already dressed and cold. "You came to my quarters unchaperoned," he'd said, straightening his uniform in the mirror. "What did you expect? A woman of your circumstances, living where you live. Don't pretend to be innocent." She'd tried to explain to the commander, to anyone who would listen, but Charles had told his version first, how she'd thrown herself at him, desperate to trap an officer into marriage. How he'd rebuffed her advances and she'd threatened scandal. His fellow officers corroborated his story. She was, after all, living in a boarding house of questionable reputation. She worked in trade. She had no family, no connections, no one to vouch for her character. The story had spread like wildfire through Fort Bellingham, embellished with each telling until she became a Jezebel who'd tried to seduce half the regiment. The general store let her go. Her cousin, fearing for her own reputation, told her to leave. And so began her journey from town to town, the story always arriving before she did, growing more damning with each mile. Margaret opened her eyes to the desert darkness. Tears had dried on her cheeks without her noticing. It didn't matter now. Soon it would all be over. She was so tired, tired of defending herself against lies, tired of begging for basic human kindness, tired of being hungry and thirsty and alone. She thought of the cowboy outside the saloon, the way he'd watched her without the usual leer or disgust. For a moment, she'd almost wanted to speak to him, to see if perhaps one person in this harsh land might listen. But what was the point? He'd hear the story soon enough. Margaret lay back against the cold ground, looking up at the stars. They seemed very close out here, close enough to touch. She wondered if her parents were up there somewhere, if they could see what had become of their daughter. She hoped not. A coyote howled in the distance, answered by another. The sound should have frightened her, but it didn't. Nothing could frighten her now. She closed her eyes and waited. The sound of horse hooves on stone made her eyes snap open. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming, but the sound grew closer, steady and unhurried. A shape materialized from the darkness, a man on horseback, leading a second horse. He dismounted a few yards away, moving with the careful grace of someone who'd spent his life around skittish animals. In the starlight, she recognized him. The cowboy from town. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and calm, like he was gentling a spooked mare. "Mighty cold night to be out here alone." Margaret struggled to sit up, her voice hoarse. "Leave me be." He didn't move closer, just stood there holding his horse's reins. "Can't do that, ma'am. Wouldn't be right." "Nothing about any of this is right," she said bitterly. "No," he agreed. "Reckon it's not." They stayed like that for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. Finally, he spoke again. "Name's Jake Coulter. I've got a place about 5 miles north. Nothing fancy, but it's got 4 walls and a roof. Got some beans and coffee, too." "I know what you've heard about me," Margaret said. "I know what everyone says. I make it a habit not to listen to everyone," Jake replied. He moved then, slow and easy, until he was close enough that she could see his face in the starlight, weather-worn and honest, with eyes that had seen plenty but hadn't grown hard. "Way I see it, a woman doesn't walk into the desert to die over nothing. And Cedar Ridge." He shook his head. "That town's got a mean streak wider than the Rio Grande." Margaret felt something crack inside her chest. "I can't pay you. I have nothing." "Didn't ask for payment." He held out his hand. "But if you stay out here, the coyotes will have you by morning, or the cold will. Seems a waste either way." She looked at his outstretched hand, work roughened and steady. How long since someone had offered her their hand without expecting something shameful in return? "Why?" she whispered. Jake considered the question. "My ma used to say that the measure of a man wasn't in how he treated his equals, but how he treated those who had nothing to offer him. Haven't thought about that in years, but seeing you in town today, well, I figured it was time to remember." Margaret's legs shook as she tried to stand. Jake caught her elbow, supporting her weight without making her feel weak. He helped her onto the spare horse, then swung up onto his own mount. "It's a ways to ride," he said. "You just hold on. I'll handle the rest." As they moved through the darkness, Margaret allowed herself one last look back at the spot where she'd meant to die. Then she faced forward, toward whatever came next. She was still banished, still bearing the weight of lies she couldn't disprove. But for the first time in months, she wasn't facing it alone. Jake rode steady and sure beside her, occasionally glancing over to make sure she was managing. When she swayed in the saddle, he moved his horse closer, ready to catch her if she fell. He didn't speak, didn't ask questions, just offered the solid comfort of his presence. She was banished from every door, he said softly, more to himself than to her. "Stay under my roof." Margaret heard the words but couldn't quite believe them. After so much cruelty, kindness felt like a foreign language. But as they rode through the desert night, she held onto them like a lifeline. These simple words from a stranger who asked for nothing but offered shelter to the forsaken. The ranch house materialized from the darkness like something conjured from a dream, solid and real against the star-scattered sky. It was modest, built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud. But smoke curled from the stone chimney and lamplight glowed warm through the windows. After weeks of closed doors and cold faces, it looked like paradise. Jake dismounted first, moving to help Margaret down from her horse. Her legs buckled as they touched ground, muscles cramped from the ride. He steadied her with a hand at her elbow, patient as she found her balance. "Easy now," he murmured. "Ground's always harder than it looks after a long ride." He led the horses to a lean-to beside the house, while Margaret stood swaying, unsure what to do with herself. When he returned, he guided her to the door with the same gentle touch. "Welcome to the Double C," he said, lifting the latch. "It ain't much, but it's home." The interior was one large room with a loft above. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The furniture was handmade but sturdy, a table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair by the fire, shelves holding a few dishes and supplies. Everything was clean and orderly. Speaking of a man who took care with his surroundings, Margaret stood just inside the door, arms wrapped around herself. The warmth was almost painful after the cold, making her realize how chilled she'd become. Jake moved past her to the fire, adding another log. "Sit," he said, indicating the rocking chair. "You're about frozen through." She sank into the chair, its gentle motion foreign after so long. Jake busied himself at the stove, not looking at her directly, giving her time to adjust. The normalcy of it, the domestic sounds of cooking, the warmth, the safety, made her throat tight with unshed tears. Soon the smell of coffee filled the room, followed by the scent of beans warming. Jake set a cup on the small table beside her chair, then returned with a plate. Simple fare. But Margaret's stomach clenched at the sight of it. When had she last eaten a real meal? "Thank you," she whispered. Jake pulled the other chair near the fire and sat, cradling his own cup. They ate in silence. But it wasn't the oppressive silence she'd grown used to. This was comfortable, undemanding. The fire popped and settled. Wind whispered around the corners of the house. Normal sounds of a normal evening. Except nothing about this was normal for her anymore. "There's a curtain up there," Jake said eventually, nodding toward the loft. "You can have the bed. I'll take the floor down here." Margaret's hand stilled on her cup. Here it was, the expectation, the price. There was always a price. I don't. "That's my bed up there," Jake continued as if she hadn't spoken. "Clean sheets last Sunday. There's a wash basin and pitcher, too. Lock on the inside of the curtain if you want it." She looked at him then. Really looked. His face was weathered but not old, maybe 35 to her 26. Laugh lines around brown eyes that stayed steady on hers, not dropping to survey her body like she'd grown accustomed to. Strong jaw shadowed with a day's growth of beard. Hands that stayed relaxed on his coffee cup, making no move toward her. "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "Why are you doing this?" Jake considered, his gaze shifting to the fire. "You ever watch a storm coming across the prairie? See a calf separated from the herd, bawling and lost? You don't ask why you help, you just do. I'm not a lost calf." "No," he agreed. "You're a woman who's had a harder road than most, but the principle's the same." Margaret set down her plate, food half finished despite her hunger. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've done. I know what I saw in town today. Woman going door to door, asking for nothing but basic human kindness, being turned away by folks who go to church every Sunday and preach about charity." His voice held quiet disgust. "I know you were ready to die out there rather than keep facing that. Seems to me that says more about your character than any gossip." The tears came then. Silent streams down her cheeks. Jake didn't move, didn't try to comfort her, just let her cry. When the storm passed, he handed her a clean handkerchief without comment. "I'll show you the loft," he said, rising. "You need rest." The loft was simple but clean, as he'd promised. A narrow bed with a colorful quilt, a washstand, a small trunk. A curtain could be pulled across the opening, and yes, there was a simple hook lock on the inside. Margaret fingered it, wonderingly. When was the last time she'd been able to lock a door? "I'll be down below if you need anything," Jake said. "Otherwise, I'll see you come morning." He turned to go, but Margaret caught his sleeve. "Mr. Coulter, Jake, I need you to know. What they say about me. It's not true, not the way they tell it." Jake looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. "Ma'am, you don't owe me any explanations. Your past is your business. You're safe here tonight, and tomorrow if you choose. That's all that matters." He descended the ladder, leaving Margaret alone in the lamplight. She sank onto the bed, testing its softness. Real sheets, a real pillow, She'd been sleeping in barns and under wagons for so long. She'd forgotten the simple luxury of a bed. Below, she heard Jake moving around, banking the fire, settling onto what sounded like a bedroll near the hearth. The ordinary sounds of someone preparing for sleep. No heavy footsteps on the ladder. No testing of the curtain. Just quiet breathing and the occasional pop from the dying fire. Margaret washed her face and hands, the cool water a blessing against her sunburned skin. She unpinned what was left of her hair, finger-combing the worst of the tangles. Her dress was beyond salvaging, but it was all she had. She lay down fully clothed, pulling the quilt up to her chin. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she expected to hear boots on the ladder, expected the curtain to be pulled aside, but the house stayed quiet except for Jake's steady breathing below. Gradually, muscle by muscle, she began to relax. When she woke, sunlight was streaming through the small window. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then memory flooded back. The desert, Jake's kindness, the impossible safety of his home. She lay still, listening. Sounds drifted up from below, the stove door opening, coffee grinding, boots on wood floors, normal morning sounds. She rose and tidied herself as best she could, then carefully descended the ladder. Jake looked up from the stove. "Morning. Coffee's ready." Margaret wrapped the borrowed shawl tighter around her shoulders. He must have left it on the chair while she slept. "I should go. I've imposed enough." "Go where?" Jake asked mildly, pouring 2 cups. "Back to Cedar Ridge. On to the next town that'll treat you the same?" He shook his head. "Drink your coffee. We'll figure the rest after breakfast." She sat because her legs wouldn't hold her much longer anyway. The coffee was strong and good, warming her from the inside. Jake set a plate of biscuits and gravy in front of her, then sat with his own. "I need to check the cattle after this," he said. "You're welcome to come along or stay here, whatever suits you." "I can't just stay," Margaret said. "People will talk. People always talk. Let 'em." He buttered a biscuit with careful attention. "I've got work needs doing around here. Can't pay much, but there's room and board, if you're interested." Margaret stared at him. "You're offering me a job?" "If you want it. Can you cook?" "Yes, but..." "So?" "Of course, but then seems like we could help each other." He met her eyes. "This ain't charity. If that's what's bothering you, I work dawn to dusk, and coming home to a hot meal would be worth its weight in gold. Been mending my own shirts so long. I look like a scarecrow half the time." Margaret looked around the clean, sparse room. It needed a woman's touch. Curtains for the windows, maybe a rug by the fire, small things that made a house a home. Could she dare to hope again? "People will say terrible things," she warned. "About you, about why I'm here." Jake's smile was wry. "Ma'am, I've been called worse than whatever they'll dream up. Question is, can you handle staying? Knowing they'll gossip?" Margaret thought about the alternative. Back on the road, going from town to town, dying a little more each day. Then she looked at this man who'd offered her shelter without condition, dignity without judgment. "Yes," she said quietly. "I can handle it." Jake nodded, satisfied. "Good. Then welcome to the Double C, Miss Thorne. Let's see about getting you properly settled." For the first time in months, Margaret felt something she'd thought lost forever. Hope. It was fragile as a new flame, but here in this simple house with this quiet man, she would tend it carefully and see if it could grow. Word traveled fast in frontier country. By the end of the first week, everyone in Cedar Ridge knew that Jake Coulter had taken in that woman. The whispers started at the general store and spread like wildfire through the church socials and quilting bees. Jake felt the change the moment he rode into town for supplies. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when he passed. Men who'd shared drinks with him at the Lucky Dollar suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. Women clutched their skirts aside as if sin might be contagious. At Harrison's general store, Samuel Harrison barely looked up from his ledger. "Got your order ready, Coulter?" His tone was ice cold. nothing like the friendly banter they'd shared for years. Jake loaded the supplies methodically. Flour, coffee, beans, salt pork. He added a bolt of simple calico and some thread. Practical choices that nonetheless raised Harrison's eyebrows. "That all?" Harrison asked, tallying with sharp pencil strokes. "That's all." Harrison named the sum, then added, "Might be best if you sent someone else to collect orders from now on. My wife's particular about the company we keep." Jake counted out the money slowly, meeting Harrison's eyes. "Been trading here 5 years? Sam, never caused you trouble? That was before you took up with—" Harrison caught himself, but his meaning was clear. "Just thinking of your reputation, Jake. Man's got to live in this community." "Man's got to live with himself first," Jake replied evenly. He gathered his purchases and left, the bell jangling discordantly behind him. Outside, Thomas Wellington and Edgar Moss stood by the hitching post, blocking his path to his horse. Both were ranchers with spreads neighboring Jake's land, men he'd worked alongside during roundups and brandings. "Jake," Wellington said, his voice falsely hearty. "Haven't seen you about much lately." "Been busy with the ranch." "So we heard." Moss spat tobacco juice dangerously close to Jake's boots. "Heard you been real busy." Jake's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "You boys got something to say. Say it straight." Wellington's friendly mask slipped. "That woman's poison. Jake, don't know what sob story she spun for you, but she's nothing but trouble. They ran her out of Fort Bellingham for good reason." "Did they now?" Jake shifted his packages, freeing his right hand. "And you know this how? You there when it happened?" "Everyone knows. Everyone knows gossip and lies." Jake cut him off. "Not the same as truth." Moss stepped closer, his breath sour with whiskey despite the early hour. "She's got you addled, Coulter, thinking with the wrong parts, if you catch my meaning." "Watch your mouth, Edgar." "Or what?" Moss sneered. "You'll defend her honor." "What honor? Woman like that?" Jake's fist connected with Moss's jaw before he could finish the sentence. Moss stumbled backward, crashing into a water barrel. Wellington grabbed Jake's arm, but Jake shook him off. "Next man who speaks ill of a woman under my protection will get worse," Jake said, his voice deadly quiet. "Spread the word." He loaded his supplies and rode out, leaving Moss sputtering in the dust and Wellington looking after him with narrowed eyes. Back at the ranch, Margaret was hanging laundry on the line he'd strung between 2 posts. She'd taken to the work with quiet efficiency, transforming his bachelor quarters bit by bit. The windows sparkled clean. Wildflowers sat in a jar on the table, and something that smelled like heaven was baking in the oven. She turned at his approach, shading her eyes against the sun. He saw her notice his skinned knuckles, the tension in his shoulders. "Trouble in town?" she asked softly. Jake dismounted, leading his horse to the trough. "Nothing I couldn't handle." Margaret abandoned the laundry, coming to help with the supplies, as they worked together unloading. She said, "It's getting worse, isn't it? The talk?" "Don't matter none." She touched his arm, making him stop. "It matters. Your reputation, your standing in the community. I'm destroying it all." "My reputation," Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Margaret, I'm a 35-year-old bachelor who keeps to himself and reads too many books. They already thought I was odd. Least now they've got something interesting to gossip about." That night, the trouble came to them. Jake woke to the sound of horses approaching. Too many horses for honest business at this hour. He rolled from his bedroll, reaching for the rifle propped by the door. "Stay up there," he called softly to Margaret. "No matter what you hear." He eased the door open as 3 riders pulled up in his yard, Wellington and Moss, accompanied by Reverend Mills. They'd been drinking. He could smell it from the porch. "Evening, gentlemen," Jake said, rifle casual in his hands. "Bit late for a social call. We've come to talk sense into you," Wellington declared, "as Christian men and your neighbors." "Since when do Christian men need liquid courage for talking?" Jake asked mildly. Reverend Mills dismounted unsteadily. "Jake Coulter, you're living in sin with a fallen woman. It's our duty to—" "To what?" Jake stepped onto the porch, rifle still relaxed but ready. To judge? Thought that was the Lord's job? Reverend? The Bible says. I know what the Bible says. Also says something about casting the first stone. Any of you boys without sin? Jake's voice hardened. Tom, didn't you run off Seth Parker's hired hand last year? Claimed he stole from you, but everyone knows it was because he was sweet on your daughter. And Edgar, how's that land dispute with the Mexicans down valley going? The one where you moved their fence markers in the night. Both men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. And Reverend. Jake continued. Didn't Jesus himself eat with tax collectors and prostitutes? Show compassion to the woman at the well? Or do you only preach the parts that let you feel righteous? This is different, Mills sputtered. She's a woman who needed help. Jake cut him off. I offered it. She works for room and board, proper as any arrangement. If your minds are in the gutter, that's your failing, not ours. Moss had recovered from the afternoon's punch, and his liquid courage made him bold. You're a fool. Coulter, she's using you. Soon as she's got her hooks in deep enough, she'll take everything you've got and move on to the next. The rifle swung up, aimed steady at Moss's chest. Get off my land, all of you, now. You can't threaten us, Wellington blustered, but he was already turning his horse. I'm not threatening. I'm telling you to leave. Come back uninvited, and I'll consider it trespassing. I believe the law's on my side there. They left, but Jake knew this wasn't over. He stood on the porch until the hoofbeats faded, then went back inside. Margaret stood at the bottom of the ladder, wrapped in the shawl he'd given her. Her face was pale, but composed. I'm sorry, she whispered. You heard? She nodded. They're right about one thing. I am destroying your life here. Jake set the rifle back in its place and turned to her. In the moonlight through the window, she looked fragile as spun glass. You're not destroying anything. They are, with their small minds and smaller hearts. But this is your home. These are your neighbors. Neighbors who'd turn their backs on a woman in need, who'd ride out drunk in the night to intimidate and threaten. Jake shook his head. Maybe it's time I knew their true colors. Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears. You've been nothing but kind to me. I can't let you sacrifice everything for what? For doing what's right? Jake stepped closer, close enough to see the play of emotions across her face. Margaret, I've lived here 5 years, built this place with my own hands, ran cattle, kept to myself, and in all that time, I've never felt... Never mind. Point is, you're not forcing me to do anything. This is my choice. A tear escaped, tracking down her cheek. Without thinking, Jake reached out and caught it with his thumb. The touch was electric, sending shock waves through them both. Margaret's breath caught. Jake's hand stilled against her cheek. For a moment, they stood frozen, the air between them charged with possibility. Then Jake dropped his hand and stepped back. You should get some rest, he said, his voice rougher than intended. Morning comes early. Margaret nodded and turned toward the ladder, then paused. Jake, thank you for defending me. No one's ever... I'm not used to having someone in my corner. Get used to it, Jake said softly. After she'd gone up, Jake stood in the darkness for a long time, listening to her move about overhead. He'd meant what he said. This was his choice. But Lord help him, he was starting to realize it wasn't just about doing right anymore. Somewhere along the way, between her quiet strength and gentle presence, between the way she hummed while she worked and the way she looked at him like he'd hung the moon just for offering basic decency, somewhere in there, Jake Coulter had started to fall, and that, more than all the threats and gossip in the world, truly did have the power to destroy them both. The weeks that followed the midnight confrontation brought an unexpected peace to the Double C Ranch. Jake and Margaret fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing, him working the cattle and fences, her tending the house and garden. They moved around each other with careful courtesy, but beneath the surface, something deeper was taking root. Margaret had transformed the sparse bachelor quarters into a home. Checked curtains now framed the windows, sewn from the calico Jake had bought, She'd started a kitchen garden with seeds traded from a traveling peddler, coaxing green shoots from the reluctant desert soil. In the evenings, while Jake mended tack or worked on ledgers, she would read aloud from his small collection of books, Shakespeare, Defoe, and, surprisingly, Jane Austen. "My mother loved books," Jake explained one evening when she'd expressed surprise at finding Pride and Prejudice among his belonging and used to read to us kids every night. Guess some of it stuck. "Us kids?" Margaret asked, looking up from the page. In all their weeks together, he'd shared little about his past. Jake's hand stilled on the bridle he was repairing. "Had 2 sisters, lost them and Ma to scarlet fever when I was 16. Pa didn't last long after that. Broken heart, the doc said." He resumed his work, voice carefully neutral. "Sold the farm back in Missouri and headed west. Been drifting ever since, until I found this place." Margaret understood then why he lived alone, why he'd been so quick to offer shelter. He knew what it meant to lose everything, to be adrift in the world. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Long time ago now." But his eyes, when they met hers, held shadows. "What about you? You mentioned Philadelphia once." And so, bit by bit, she told him about her father's banking career, her mother's early death, the life of privilege that had vanished like smoke. She spoke of her education, her accomplishments, things that meant nothing in the frontier but everything to who she'd been. "I played piano," she said wistfully. "Bach, Mozart, Chopin. My fingers still remember the movements sometimes." Jake watched her hands unconsciously mime the motions of playing, elegant even in their work-worn state. "There's a piano in the church," he said. "Probably dusty as hell, pardon, heck, but—" "No?" Margaret's hand stilled. "That part of my life is gone." They lapsed into comfortable silence, but Jake filed the information away. Margaret Thorne was full of surprises, layers of refinement beneath the practical frontier woman she'd become. It made what had happened to her all the more tragic, and his protective instincts all the stronger. As spring deepened toward summer, their isolated peace was broken by necessity. The garden needed more seeds. Flour was running low, and Jake needed to arrange for help with the upcoming roundup. A trip to town couldn't be avoided. "I'll go alone," Jake said over breakfast. "No need for you to face that." Margaret's chin lifted. "I'm not hiding forever. Jake, besides, I need thread for your shirts and some other notions. We'll go together." He wanted to argue, but recognized the steel in her voice. This was the woman who'd survived being cast out, who'd nearly died rather than surrender her dignity. Who was he to tell her to cower? They rode in together on a morning when the desert bloomed with spring flowers. Margaret wore her best remaining dress, carefully mended and pressed, and had pinned her hair in a style that recalled her Philadelphia days. Jake had never seen her look more beautiful or more nervous. The town seemed to hold its breath as they rode down Main Street. Curtains twitched, conversations stopped, children were pulled closer to their mother's skirts. Jake kept his horse close to Margaret's, a united front against the stairs. At the general store, Mrs. Harrison stood behind the counter, her husband conspicuously absent. Her face went rigid as they entered. "We don't serve," she began, but Jake cut her off. "You serve paying customers," he said evenly, placing a gold piece on the counter. "We need supplies." Margaret moved through the store with quiet dignity, selecting thread, needles, a packet of pins. She lingered over a bolt of blue fabric that would bring out her eyes, but moved on without touching it. Jake noted the longing look and quietly added it to their pile when she wasn't watching. Mrs. Harrison tallied their purchases in stony silence, practically throwing their change at them. As they turned to leave, she couldn't resist a parting shot. "Living in sin," she hissed. "Bold as brass, shopping together like decent folk." Margaret froze. Jake saw her shoulders tremble and moved to respond, but she beat him to it. Turning back, she faced Mrs. Harrison with a composure that would have done a Philadelphia drawing room proud. "Judge not, lest ye be judged," she quoted softly. "I seem to recall that from Sunday school. Perhaps you've forgotten." She paused, then added, "I work for Mr. Coulter as housekeeper and cook. If your mind insists on making it something tawdry, perhaps you should examine your own heart." She swept from the store, leaving Mrs. Harrison gaping like a landed fish. Jake followed, hiding his grin. Outside, Margaret was shaking. I shouldn't have," she stammered. "That was magnificent," Jake said firmly. About time someone gave Martha Harrison a taste of her own medicine. They finished their errands quickly. Jake arranged for 2 hands to help with roundup, while Margaret waited with the horses. As they prepared to leave, a commotion arose near the saloon. A young woman, barely more than a girl, was being dragged roughly by a man twice her size. "You owe me, Lily," the man shouted, obviously drunk despite the early hour. 3 months' room and board, and this is how you repay me?" The girl, Lily, was crying, trying to pull free. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing bruises. "Please, Mr. Garrett, I said I'd pay when I could." "With what?" Garrett shook her roughly. "You got no job, no money, no family. Just like that other harlot." His eyes landed on Margaret and Jake. "Well, speak of the devil." Jake dismounted slowly, his hand near his gun. "Let the girl go. Garrett, none of your business. Coulter, this is between me and my tenant." Garrett's grip tightened on Lily's arm, making her whimper. "Let her go," Jake repeated, his voice deadly calm. "Now, or what? You'll defend another fallen woman? Start a collection?" Garrett laughed uglily. "Though I guess one man can only handle so many." He never finished the sentence. Jake's fist caught him square in the nose, sending him sprawling in the dust. Lily scrambled away, cowering against a hitching post. Garrett struggled up, blood streaming down his face. "You broke my nose! Touch her again and I'll break more than that." Jake turned to Lily. "You hurt, miss?" The girl nodded, tears streaming. She couldn't have been more than 18, with the worn look of someone who'd seen too much too young. Margaret had dismounted and moved to the girl's side, offering her handkerchief. "She owes me rent," Garrett sputtered from the ground. "Send me a bill," Jake said curtly. "The lady won't be returning to your establishment." "Lady?" Garrett laughed bitterly. "She's no more a lady than that." "Careful," Jake warned. "My patience is wearing thin." A crowd had gathered, watching the drama unfold. Jake scanned the faces, some sympathetic, most merely curious, a few openly hostile. These were the people who'd turned their backs on Margaret, who'd stood by while she nearly died. His decision was easy. "Miss Lily," he said formally, "we'd be pleased to offer you a ride, if you've somewhere to go." The girl looked between him and Margaret, hope warring with fear. I got nobody, no place. That's why I couldn't leave before." Margaret stepped forward. "Then you'll come with us. We need help with the upcoming roundup, cooking for the extra hands, mending, such like, room and board and fair wages." "Margaret," Jake said quietly, "are you sure?" She met his eyes steadily. "Someone gave me a chance when I had nothing. Seems only right to pass it on." And so they left Cedar Ridge with an addition to their party. Lily perched behind Margaret, clutching a small bundle of possessions. The townspeople watched in stunned silence as Jake Coulter, who'd already ruined his reputation for one fallen woman, now rode out with 2. That evening, as they settled Lily into the barn, temporarily, until they could fashion proper quarters, Jake pulled Margaret aside. "That was a brave thing you did today. All of it." Margaret looked toward the barn where lamplight showed Lily making her bed in the hay. "I know what she's feeling. The fear, the desperation. If we don't help her, who will?" "The same people who helped you," Jake said pointedly. "No one." "Exactly." Margaret turned to him, and in the fading light, he saw tears in her eyes. "You saved my life. Jake, do you know that? Not just by taking me in, but by showing me that there are still good people in this world. That kindness exists. That I could be more than what they said I was." Jake reached out without thinking, cupping her face in his calloused hands. "You were always more than that. From the moment I saw you, I knew." "How?" she whispered. "Because I looked past the gossip and saw the truth. A woman of strength and grace who'd been dealt a bad hand but hadn't let it break her spirit." His thumbs traced her cheekbones. "You think I saved you, but truth is, you saved me too. This place was just walls and work before you came. Now it's home." Margaret's eyes searched his. "Jake." He knew he should step back. Knew he was crossing a line they'd both been careful to maintain. But Lord help him, he couldn't move. Instead, he leaned closer, drawn by something stronger than propriety or sense. "I'm falling in love with you," he said simply. "Have been since that first night. Thought you should know." Margaret's breath caught. For a moment, she stood frozen. Then she raised her hands to cover his where they rested on her face. "Oh, Jake, I feel it too, but how can we? Everyone already thinks the worst. If we—" "I don't care what they think," Jake said fiercely. "Never have. Question is, do you?" Before she could answer, Lily's voice called from the barn, young and scared. "Miss Margaret, I'm sorry to bother, but there's something in here with me, something scratching." The moment broke. They stepped apart, the confession hanging between them like a prayer. Margaret smoothed her skirts, composed herself. "Probably just a raccoon," she called back. "I'll come see." As she turned to go, Jake caught her hand. "We'll figure it out," he said softly. "All of it, together." Margaret squeezed his fingers, then hurried to the barn. Jake watched her go, his heart full of hope and fear in equal measure. They'd crossed a bridge today, both in town and here at home. Whatever came next, there was no going back. Above, the first stars were beginning to shine, and somewhere in the desert, a coyote sang to the rising moon. The Double C Ranch had become a refuge for the lost and scorned. And maybe, just maybe, love could bloom here too, despite what the world might say. The drought came like a thief in the night, stealing the promise of spring. What had begun as a dry spell in May stretched into June, then July. The grass turned brown and brittle. The water holes shrank to muddy puddles, and the cattle grew gaunt despite Jake's efforts to find them forage. Margaret stood on the porch, shading her eyes against the merciless sun. The garden she'd coaxed from the desert soil was dying, leaves curled and brown despite her careful watering from their dwindling well. In the distance, she could see Jake and the hired hands, Tom Bradley and his younger brother Pete, moving the cattle to what little shade the canyon provided. "Miss Margaret?" Lily emerged from the house, worry creasing her young face. "The water barrel's near empty again. Should I use what's left for cooking?" Margaret calculated quickly. They'd been rationing for weeks already, but it wasn't enough. "Use half for cooking. We'll make do for washing." The drought had strained everyone. The hands worked longer hours searching for grass, coming home dust-covered and exhausted. Lily had proven herself invaluable, taking on any task without complaint. But even her natural cheerfulness had dimmed under the relentless sun. That evening, Jake returned looking grimmer than she'd ever seen him. He slumped at the table, accepting the cup of water she offered. Coffee had become too precious to waste. "Lost 2 more head today," he said quietly. "Found them down by Skeleton Ridge. The water hole there's gone completely dry." Margaret's heart sank. They'd already lost 12 cattle, each one a significant blow to the ranch's survival. "What about Miller's Creek? You said there was usually water there even in dry years." "Checked it yesterday. Bone dry." Jake rubbed his face, exhaustion evident in every line. "Tom Bradley says there's still water at Comanche Springs, about 15 miles north. But that's a hard day's ride with cattle in this condition." "Then we'll have to try," Margaret said firmly. "We can't just watch them die." Jake looked up at her, a ghost of a smile crossing his face. "We? You don't think I'm staying here while you risk everything?" Margaret lifted her chin. "Lily can manage the house. You'll need every hand you can get to move the herd." "It's dangerous," Jake warned. "That route takes us through Breakneck Pass, Even in good weather, it's treacherous, and there have been reports of raiders hitting the isolated ranches, taking advantage of folks weakened by the drought. All the more reason you need another person watching your back, they argued. But Margaret's will proved as unyielding as the drought. 3 days later, they set out before dawn. Jake, Margaret, the Bradley brothers, and the remnants of the herd. Lily waved them off, promising to keep the home fires burning. The first day was brutal. The cattle, already weakened, moved slowly. Dust rose in choking clouds, coating everything. Margaret had bound her hair and covered her face with a bandana, but grit still found its way into every crevice. Her throat burned with thirst, but she limited herself to small sips from her canteen. By evening, they'd covered barely 8 miles. They made camp in a box canyon that offered minimal shelter. Everyone too exhausted for more than basic tasks. Margaret helped Tom Bradley with the evening meal, beans and hardtack, with precious water for the coffee. "You're tougher than you look, ma'am," Pete Bradley said admiringly as Margaret expertly handled the camp cooking despite the conditions. "Anyone can be tough when they have to be," Margaret replied, but she caught Jake's proud smile across the campfire. The second day brought new challenges. As they entered the approaches to Breakneck Pass, the terrain grew increasingly treacherous. The trail narrowed, with sheer drops on one side and crumbling rock faces on the other. The cattle, sensing danger, grew skittish. They were halfway through the pass when disaster struck. A rattlesnake, hidden in the rocks, spooked the led steer. The animal bellowed and lurched sideways, starting a chain reaction. In seconds, panic rippled through the herd. "Stampede!" Tom Bradley shouted. Jake spurred his horse forward, trying to turn the leaders before they went over the edge. Pete rode the flank, whistling and shouting. Margaret found herself in the path of frightened cattle, her horse dancing nervously as tons of beef thundered past. A young steer, eyes rolling white with terror, veered directly toward the cliff edge. Without thinking, Margaret urged her mount forward, cutting across its path. Her horse stumbled on loose rocks, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought they'd both go over. Then her mount found its footing, and she managed to turn the steer back towards safety. When the dust settled and the herd was calm, Jake rode up beside her, his face pale beneath the dirt. "That was the most foolish, brave thing I've ever seen," he said, voice rough with emotion. "You could have been killed." "So could that steer," Margaret replied, trying to sound casual despite her hammering heart. "We can't afford to lose any more." That night, camped at the base of the pass, the mood was somber despite their success. They'd lost only one animal, miraculous under the circumstances, but everyone knew how close they'd come to disaster. Jake found Margaret sitting apart from the others, staring up at the star-filled sky. He settled beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You scared me today," he admitted quietly. "I scared myself," Margaret confessed. "But I keep thinking, 6 months ago, I was ready to die in the desert. Now, even with all this hardship, I want to live so badly it hurts." "What changed?" Margaret turned to look at him, seeing his weathered face silvered by moonlight. "You know what changed." The tension that had simmered between them since that evening at the ranch flared hot and immediate. Jake reached for her hand, and Margaret didn't pull away. "When this is over," he said, "when we get through this drought and things are settled, I want to court you proper, do things right." "Jake, I know what people will say, but I also know what I feel. You're not my housekeeper anymore. Margaret, haven't been for a long time. You're my partner in everything that matters." Before Margaret could respond, a shout from Tom Bradley shattered the moment. "Riders coming! 3, maybe 4! Jake was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. Margaret grabbed her own weapon. Jake had insisted on teaching her to shoot, and she'd proven a quick study. The riders materialized from the darkness, rough men on tired horses, the kind who might be cowboys or might be something worse. They stopped just outside the ring of firelight. "Evening," their leader called. A scar ran from his left eye to his jaw, giving his smile a sinister cast. "Saw your fire. Thought we'd see if you could spare some coffee for fellow travelers." "Coffee's scarce," Jake replied evenly. "But you're welcome to water your horses." The scarred man's gaze traveled over their camp, lingering on Margaret. "That's unfriendly. Here we are, just trying to be neighborly." His companions chuckled. An ugly sound. "State your business and move on," Jake said, his rifle shifting slightly. "Our business?" The leader dismounted slowly, his hand near his gun. "Well now, that's interesting. See, we heard there was a herd moving through. Figured maybe the owner might want some help, or maybe might want to discuss a toll for passing through." "This is open range," Tom Bradley spoke up. "No tolls here. Things change," the scarred man said. "Drought makes people desperate. Some might even say a man traveling with women and weakened cattle is asking for trouble." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Margaret counted 4 of them, all armed, but they had advantages too. Good cover, knowledge of their own capabilities. "Only trouble here is what you're bringing," Jake said calmly. "I'll ask you once more to move on. Won't ask a third time." The tension stretched taut. Margaret's finger found her trigger. Ready. She saw Pete Bradley ease his pistol from its holster. Tom doing the same. "Finally," the scarred man laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Maybe another time then, when the odds are more favorable." He remounted, his men following suit. "You folks be careful now. Dangerous country, especially for those who don't pay their way." They rode off into the darkness, but no one relaxed. Jake immediately set double watches, and Margaret knew none of them would sleep easy. "They'll be back," Tom Bradley said grimly. "Their kind always comes back." "Let 'em," Jake replied. "We'll be ready." But as Margaret finally tried to rest, she wondered if they truly would be. They were exhausted, outnumbered, protecting weakened cattle in hostile terrain. The drought had been enemy enough. Now they had human predators to contend with as well. She thought of Lily, alone at the ranch, and prayed the girl would be safe. She thought of the cattle, depending on them to reach water. Most of all, she thought of Jake's words by the campfire and wondered if they'd live to see that proper courtship he'd promised. The night wind carried the sound of coyotes calling, and somewhere in the darkness, Margaret knew, those riders were making their own plans. Tomorrow would bring Comanche Springs, if they could survive to reach it. Dawn came blood-red over the desert, painting the rocks in shades of rust and shadow. They broke camp quickly, everyone aware that the scarred man and his riders were somewhere out there, waiting. The cattle seemed to sense the urgency, moving with more purpose despite their weakened state. They reached Comanche Springs by midday, a sight that nearly brought tears to Margaret's eyes. Green grass surrounded the natural spring, and clear water bubbled up from the rocks. The cattle surged forward, desperate to drink, and it took all 4 riders to keep them from gorging themselves sick. "Let them drink slow," Jake instructed, though his own throat was parched. "Too much too fast will kill them sure as the drought." As the animals drank and grazed, Jake pulled Tom Bradley aside. Margaret saw them talking in low voices, gesturing toward the surrounding hills. She knew what worried them. The springs were in a natural bowl, surrounded by high ground, perfect for an ambush. That evening, they made camp near the water, but Jake positioned them carefully, backs to a rock face. Clear sight lines in all directions. The cattle, strengthened by water and grass, were corralled in a makeshift pen of rope and brush. "I'll take first watch," Jake said as darkness fell. "I'll stay up with you," Margaret offered, but he shook his head. "You need rest. Tomorrow we start back, and—" The attack came without warning. Gunfire erupted from the hills, muzzle flashes like deadly fireflies. Jake dove for cover, pulling Margaret with him as bullets whined overhead. "The cattle!" Pete Bradley shouted. The scarred man's gang was trying to scatter the herd, knowing that without the cattle, Jake would be ruined. Tom and Pete returned fire, trying to keep the raiders at bay. "Stay down," Jake ordered Margaret, but she was already moving, rifle in hand. Like hell, she muttered, finding a position behind a boulder. The firefight was chaos, shadows moving in darkness, the crack of rifles, the terrified bellowing of cattle. Margaret forced herself to breathe steady, to aim carefully as Jake had taught her. She squeezed the trigger and saw one of the raiders stumble, but they were outnumbered and outpositioned. The raiders had the high ground and seemed to have plenty of ammunition. Worse, some were working their way around the flanks, trying to encircle them. "Jake!" Tom Bradley's voice was tight with pain. "I'm hit." Jake cursed and started toward his fallen hand, but bullets drove him back. Margaret could see Tom writhing on the ground, clutching his shoulder, too far from cover to reach safely. Without thinking, she broke from her position. Running low across the open ground, bullets kicked up dust at her feet. But she reached Tom and helped drag him to safety. Something hot creased her arm, but she ignored it, focused on getting the wounded man to cover. "Damn fool woman." Tom gasped, but his eyes were grateful. The battle raged on. Pete Bradley fought like a man possessed, defending his wounded brother. Jake seemed to be everywhere at once, his rifle never missing, but they were slowly being pushed back, their ammunition running low. Then Margaret heard it, horses approaching from the east. Her heart sank. More raiders meant they were finished, but as the riders crested the hill, she saw uniforms. Cavalry blue. "Soldiers!" she screamed. "The cavalry's here!" The tide turned in an instant, caught between Jake's desperate defenders and a patrol from Fort Belknap. The raiders scattered. The scarred man tried to rally them, but a cavalry carbine found him, and he toppled from his horse. When the dust settled, Lieutenant Robert Hastings dismounted, surveying the scene. "Mr. Coulter, we heard the gunfire. Seems we arrived just in time." "Thank God for that," Jake said, lowering his rifle with hands that Margaret noticed were shaking slightly. "What brings you out this way, Lieutenant?" "Chasing these very men," Hastings replied. "They've been terrorizing the territory for weeks. Looks like you did our job for us." As the soldiers secured the surviving raiders and tended the wounded, Margaret felt the adrenaline drain away, leaving her weak. That's when Jake noticed the blood on her sleeve. "You're hurt." He was at her side instantly, carefully examining the wound, a deep graze along her upper arm. "It's nothing," she protested, but Jake was already tearing strips from his shirt to bind it. "Nothing? You could have been killed, running out there like that, to save Tom Bradley." She interrupted. "Just like you would have done." Lieutenant Hastings approached, having noticed their interaction. "This is the woman from Cedar Ridge, the one the town's been gossiping about." Jake's jaw tightened. "This is Miss Margaret Thorne, who just helped save my herd and my men. Whatever Cedar Ridge says is clearly nonsense." Hastings finished. "I've seen courage under fire before. Mr. Coulter, this woman has it in spades." He touched his hat to Margaret. "Ma'am, the Army owes you a debt. That's Sam Colton's gang you helped bring down. There's a substantial reward." Margaret blinked in surprise. "Reward? $500 for information leading to his capture? I'd say a gunfight resulting in his death qualifies." It was a fortune, enough to change everything. Margaret looked at Jake, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. "The money's yours," Jake said quietly. "You earned it." "No," Margaret said firmly. "It's ours. For the ranch." Lieutenant Hastings smiled. "I'll see the paperwork sent to Cedar Ridge, and I'll make sure everyone knows exactly how that money was earned. Might change a few minds about certain rumors." As the cavalry prepared to depart with their prisoners, Hastings pulled Jake aside. Margaret couldn't hear the conversation, but she saw Jake's face grow serious, then determined. When he returned, there was something different in his eyes. "What did he say?" she asked. "He said," Jake replied slowly, "that a woman who'd stand and fight like you did deserves better than gossip and speculation. He said if I had any sense, I'd marry you proper and make honest folks shut their mouths for good." Margaret's breath caught. "Jake." "He's right," Jake continued, dropping to one knee right there in the dusty camp, with Tom Bradley grinning through his pain and Pete whooping encouragement. Margaret Thorne, you came to me with nothing but the clothes on your back, but you brought life to my home, courage to my heart, and love to my days. I'm not a rich man, and I can't promise an easy life, but I can promise to love you, protect you, and stand by you against whatever comes. Will you marry me? Tears streamed down Margaret's face, mixing with the dirt and gunpowder residue. 6 months ago, she'd been ready to die in the desert, convinced she was worthless, ruined, beyond redemption. Now this good man was on his knees, offering her not just survival but love, partnership, a future. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, Jake Coulter, I'll marry you. He stood and kissed her, there in front of everyone, soldiers, cowboys, the vast desert sky. It was improper and scandalous and absolutely perfect. When they finally returned to the Double C 3 days later, driving cattle made strong by water and grass, they found Lily waiting anxiously. The girl burst into tears of relief when she saw them, then gasped at the news of the engagement. "A wedding!" she exclaimed. "A real wedding! Oh, Miss Margaret, what will you wear?" It was such a normal, feminine concern after their ordeal that Margaret laughed. "I have no idea. My best dress is ruined beyond repair." "Then we'll make one," Lily declared. "I saw that blue fabric, mister, Jake bought. It would be perfect." As the women planned and the men tended the cattle, Jake stood on the porch watching the sunset. The drought would break eventually. Already, clouds were building on the horizon. The ranch would survive. And against all odds, he'd found love with a woman the world had tried to break. "Regrets?" Margaret asked, joining him. "Only one," Jake said, pulling her close. "That I didn't propose sooner. It happened when it was meant to," Margaret said wisely. "We both needed time to heal, to trust, to know this was real." Inside, Lily was chattering about wedding plans, her young voice bright with excitement. The Bradley brothers were arguing good-naturedly about who'd stand as best man. It was the sound of family, of home, of future. "What do you think Cedar Ridge will say?" Margaret asked. "When they hear about the reward, the engagement?" "Let them talk," Jake said firmly. "We know the truth. That's all that matters." But as Margaret rested her head against his shoulder, watching the first stars appear, she suspected the talk would be different now. Lieutenant Hastings would see to that, and $500 in reward money spoke louder than gossip. She'd gone from fallen woman to frontier heroine, all because one man had looked past the lies to see her truth. "Stay under my roof," Jake murmured, echoing his first invitation. "For always, always," Margaret agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss as the desert wind carried the scent of coming rain. The day of reckoning came 2 weeks later, when Jake and Margaret rode into Cedar Ridge to claim the reward money and announce their engagement. Word had already spread. Lieutenant Hastings had made sure of that, and the town buzzed with conflicting rumors. Some said Margaret Thorne had single-handedly fought off a dozen outlaws. Others claimed she'd been revealed as a secret heiress. The truth, as usual, lay somewhere in between. They went first to the bank, where Mr. Jeremiah Thornton, the bank president, personally handled the reward payment. His demeanor toward Margaret had undergone a remarkable transformation. "Miss Thorne," he said, standing as they entered, something he'd never done before. "Mr. Coulter, what a pleasure. Please, sit." As he counted out the $500, he cleared his throat. "I must say, Miss Thorne, the town owes you an apology. It seems we were hasty in our judgments." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "Yes, you were." Thornton flushed but continued, "I hope you'll accept Cedar Ridge's congratulations on your upcoming nuptials. The town would be honored to host the wedding." "That's kind," Jake interjected smoothly. "But we'll be married at the ranch, family and close friends only." The banker's face fell slightly. A wedding would have been a social event, a chance for the town to fully rehabilitate its relationship with the couple. But he nodded. "Of course, your choice entirely." Their next stop was the general store. Mrs. Harrison stood behind the counter. her usual severity replaced by an anxious smile. "Miss Thorne, Mr. Coulter, how wonderful to see you both." Margaret almost laughed at the transformation. The woman who'd called her a Jezebel now simpered and fawned, eager to make amends, or at least eager to maintain the custom of a rancher with money to spend. "We need supplies," Margaret said coolly. "For a wedding." "A wedding! How delightful!" "Mrs." Harrison clapped her hands. "I have some lovely lace that just came in from St. Louis, perfect for a wedding dress trim." As Mrs. Harrison bustled about, gathering items. Other townspeople began to appear. Word spread quickly in Cedar Ridge, and soon a small crowd had gathered. Some offered genuine congratulations. Others seemed merely curious to see the woman who'd gone from pariah to hero. Then the saloon doors swung open, and Charles Whitmore stepped out. Margaret froze. She hadn't known he was in town, hadn't prepared herself for this encounter. The man who'd destroyed her life stood there in his crisp uniform, his face registering shock at seeing her. Jake felt her tense and moved closer, his hand near his gun. "Captain," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Whitmore's eyes darted between them, taking in Margaret's new clothing, her obvious prosperity, the protective stance of the man beside her. "Miss Thorne," he said uncertainly, "I heard about your adventure with the outlaws." "Captain Whitmore," Margaret said, finding her voice. Her chin lifted, and she met his gaze directly. "Still spreading lies about women who refuse you, or have you found new entertainment?" The crowd murmured, sensing drama. Whitmore's face reddened. "I don't know what you mean. If you're referring to Fort Bellingham, I'm referring," Margaret said clearly, her voice carrying to every eager ear. "To the night you invited me to dinner under false pretenses, drugged my wine, and then tried to claim I'd thrown myself at you when I threatened to report your actions." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Whitmore stepped back. That's slander. It's truth," Margaret continued, emboldened by Jake's steady presence. "And I'm done being silent about it. You destroyed my reputation, drove me from town to town, nearly killed me, all to protect your own hide. You can't prove anything." Whitmore blustered, but sweat beaded on his forehead. "Maybe not," Jake said quietly. "But Lieutenant Hastings mentioned something interesting. Seems 3 other women have made similar complaints about you since then. The Army's investigating." Whitmore went pale. Without another word, he turned and strode quickly away. Margaret knew it wasn't over. Men like him always found ways to survive. But she'd finally spoken her truth in public, and that was victory enough. The crowd dispersed slowly, full of new gossip to digest. Some looked at Margaret with new respect. Others seemed uncomfortable, perhaps recognizing their own complicity in believing the worst without question. Reverend Mills appeared as they prepared to leave, his austere face troubled. "Miss Thorne," he began, then stopped, struggling for words. "I owe you an apology. That night you came to the church, I failed in my Christian duty. I hope you can forgive me." Margaret studied him for a long moment. "I forgive you, Reverend, but perhaps next time someone comes to you in desperate need, you'll remember that mercy matters more than reputation." He nodded, chastened, and offered to perform their wedding ceremony. Margaret almost refused, but Jake touched her arm gently. "New beginnings," he murmured. She nodded. 2 weeks later, on a perfect spring morning with rain clouds blessing the horizon, Margaret Thorne married Jake Coulter at the Double C Ranch. It was a small gathering. The Bradley brothers, Lily as maid of honor, Lieutenant Hastings and a few soldiers, and, surprisingly, several ranch families from the valley who'd quietly supported Jake's decision all along. Margaret wore the dress Lily had sewn from the blue fabric, trimmed with simple lace. Jake stood tall and proud in his best shirt and a new black coat. Reverend Mills performed the ceremony with genuine warmth, having learned his lesson about judgment and mercy. "Do you, Margaret, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Reverend Mills asked. "I do," Margaret said firmly, her eyes never leaving Jake's. "Do you, Jake?" take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Jake replied, his voice thick with emotion. "For always." When they kissed, sealing their union, the small gathering erupted in cheers. Tom Bradley, arm still in a sling, fired his pistol in the air in celebration. Lily cried happy tears. Even the soldiers whooped their approval. The reception was simple but joyful. Food cooked by Lily and Margaret. Music from a fiddle Pete Bradley played. Dancing on the packed earth before the house. As evening fell, the guests gradually departed, leaving the newlyweds alone. Jake and Margaret stood on the porch, watching the sun set over their land. The drought had finally broken the week before, and green shoots were already pushing through the earth. The cattle grew fat on new grass. The ranch would prosper. "No regrets?" Jake asked, pulling his wife close. "None," Margaret assured him. "How could I regret the path that brought me to you?" Inside the house, their house now, truly and legally, a fire crackled warmly. The blue fabric scraps from Margaret's dress had been saved to make a quilt for the bed they would share. Lily had moved into her own small cabin nearby, built by the Bradley brothers as a wedding gift. Everything spoke of new beginnings, of hope, of home. "I have something for you," Jake said, producing a small, wrapped package. Margaret opened it to find a simple gold locket. Inside was a tiny photograph, Jake on one side, herself on the other, taken by a traveling photographer who'd passed through the week before. "So you never forget," Jake said softly, "that you have a place here, always." Margaret kissed him, long and sweet. "How could I forget? You saved my life. Jake Coulter." "We saved each other," he corrected. "That's what love does." Later, as they sat by the fire, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from the despair of that night in the desert to this moment of perfect contentment. It seemed like a lifetime had passed. She'd been stripped of everything, wealth, reputation, hope, only to discover that sometimes you had to lose everything to find what truly mattered. "What are you thinking?" Jake asked, watching her face in the firelight. "About the woman I was," Margaret said slowly. "That frightened, desperate creature begging for scraps of kindness. I barely recognize her now." "She's still there," Jake said gently. "That's why you helped Lily, why you fought for Tom Bradley, why you stood up to Whitmore. You remember what it's like to need mercy, so you show it to others." Margaret nodded, understanding. Her suffering hadn't been meaningless. It had given her compassion, strength, the ability to see past surfaces to the truth beneath. It had brought her to Jake, to this life she'd never imagined but couldn't imagine living without. "She was banished from every door," Margaret murmured, echoing the words that had become their refrain. "Stay under my roof," Jake completed, as he always did. "For as long as you'll have me." "Forever," Margaret promised, "and a day beyond that." Outside, the desert wind sang its ancient song, but inside the sturdy walls of the Double C Ranch, there was warmth and love and the promise of all the years to come. Margaret Thorne Coulter had found her home at last, not in a place, but in the heart of a man who'd seen her truth when the rest of the world saw only lies. The fire burned low as they talked and planned and dreamed. Two souls who'd found each other against all odds. And somewhere in the vast Texas sky, the stars looked down on a love story for the ages, born of hardship, tested by fire, and strong enough to last forever. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale from. Please comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Margaret and Jake's journey. Your support means everything.